And for more, we can cross to Austin, Texas. He's professor of history at the University of Texas. Jeremy Suri, the author of Henry Kissinger and the American Century. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Of course, a 1-minute 39 report does not do justice to the life of Henry Kissinger. Just one reaction, though, when you heard that spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry there. What were you thinking?
Well, the Chinese government has always believed that Kissinger represented exactly the kind of envoy they wanted from the United States. Someone who did not care a lot about human rights, valued the relationship with the U.S., valued stability, and also respected Chinese power. So it was a very predictable comment. It was more about Chinese hopes than it was about Henry Kissinger.
He was a cold warrior. He was he someone, though, of the past, or was he still relevant in today's world at a time when you have these old superpower rivalries that are inflamed?
Well, he was a man of the past in that he was a product of World War II, a product of the Holocaust, and a belief that the United States was one of the few powers in the world, along with France and China and Russia, that could manage international conflict. And that's a very traditional way of thinking, a very great power way of thinking. It doesn't reflect the diffusion of power in a world post-empire, in a world with new economics and new technologies. At the same time, though, he was a very modern figure in that he understood the challenges of managing powerful, difficult weapons and the importance of building what he called international rules that would govern the international space so it would not become too chaotic. And so we would not have a descent into exactly the kinds of wars we're seeing in so many regions now. So he had his traditional elements and he had his very modern elements as well.
A German Jew who flees from Nazi Germany at the age of 15, grows up in a crowded Bronx apartment, and then he goes back working for the U.S. Military intelligence as an interpreter. How did that shape his view of the world?
Well, this is something I've spent a lot of time writing about. It provided a particular framework that he brought to everything he did thereafter. He believed that the problem in Germany was not too little democracy. The problem was too little leadership. He believed that democracies needed strong leaders. This is why he revered someone like Charles de Gaulle. He believed that de Gaulle was the model that you needed in a society, a leader who would hold things together, a leader who, he said, could see the future before the people in that society could. He believed that force had to be used to enforce rules, to prevent excess violence, and to control societies. At the same time, he believed in democracy, but I would call it a controlled democracy. Many Holocaust survivors had the same reactions to the experience of Weimar Germany that he brought to his thinking about policy thereafter.
He is one of the architects, you could say, or one of the players in the signing of the Paris Treaty, which ends the Vietnam War. I remember at my college campus, professors who didn't speak to each other since the day Kissinger advised the president to bomb Cambodia. Which side of the fence will history remember him on?
I think the experience in Vietnam, and particularly the bombing of Cambodia, is one of the many dark parts of his record. He has a very mixed record. The opening to China that we've talked about, the negotiations in the Middle East, those have very positive implications. But the lying, the bombing, the rampant destruction in Vietnam and Cambodia, the coups in Chile, these are very hard to justify in retrospect. And I will also say that the ways in which he and President Nixon lied to the American public, claiming we were not bombing Cambodia when in fact our country was, that contributed to a lot of the distrust in government that we see, particularly in the United States today.
Chile's president retweeting his ambassador to the United States, who wrote, quote, "A man has died whose historical brilliance never managed to conceal his profound moral misery." Moral misery?
Well, I talk about this in some of my writing. I spent time with Kissinger, and I do think he was morally troubled. He was smart enough to recognize that many of the policies he pursued did not result in the kinds of outcomes he wanted. He did not want to see a repressive regime in Chile, but his actions led to that. So I do think there's something there, and this is why, for all of his writing, Kissinger says very little about morality. That said, I respect and admire, for all of his flaws, that this was a person who really tried to use power to get things done in the world for what he thought was a safer, more secure place, at least for American interests, as he defined them. We live in a world today where governments are incapable or seem incapable of getting things done. He gives us a model of at least trying to use power to make a difference in the world.
He lives to be 100, and it's also, and perhaps you can tell us what it was like sitting down with him, due, you might say, to a huge intellectual curiosity. He seemed to always be asking questions of the people interviewing him.
Well, what struck me in my time with Dr. Kissinger was just what you said, his curiosity. Also, I have to say his obsession with power. Coming of age during the Holocaust, seeing his family lose everything. His grandparents, his maternal grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, coming to the United States as a refugee with nothing. He was always fearful of what would happen to him and to Jews and to others if they didn't have power. And so power was never sufficient for him. He could never really retire. He never retired. He was still working incredibly hard. And that obsession with power, that drive, that ambition that was with him through the last months of his life, I think that's part of what kept him alive. But it's also what made it hard for him to reconcile to his own mistakes.
And when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when it comes to what's happening right now in the Middle East, what would a younger Kissinger have done?
Well, I think a younger Kissinger would have been very involved right now, to some extent, in the way that Secretary of State Blinken has been in trying to mediate between Israel and its neighbors and trying to bring not just a pause to the fighting, but some political solution. I think a younger Kissinger would try creative, innovative ways, maybe even involving a Palestinian state, to try to deal with this impasse that we all recognize is not going to be solved by one side bombing the other side into oblivion. I think he would be more involved in that. And I think in Ukraine, he would be advocating for a strong NATO response to Russia, but he would be very active trying to negotiate again some agreement with Putin. And perhaps that would involve the secession of some land from Ukraine to Russia. That would be a Kissinger kind of deal.
It's been more than 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. Let me ask you this, Jeremy Suri, your students, when they look at Henry Kissinger, is it like in the old days where if you were left wing, you thought one way, and if you were right wing, you thought another way?
No, it's very different with my students now. I spend a lot of time talking to them about figures like Henry Kissinger, Charles de Gaulle, and others. First of all, the stakes are much lower now. These figures seem distant to them. They find it hard to believe, actually, that a figure like Kissinger could make a difference in the world, for better and for ill, in the way he did. They're very cynical about the role of leaders in the world today. And what they remember most of Henry Kissinger, I think, are the human rights violations, the war crimes accusations. I think for a young generation, he's not a hero. He's an old wise man, a flawed old wise man.
Jeremy Suri, many thanks for speaking with us from Austin, Texas.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. There's much more to come here on France 24. More news plus the day's business and sports.